And to start this debate between preformation and epigenesis, I want to give you a definition. Preformation states that the body structures were present in the sex cells, while epigenesis states that the body structures were not present in the sex cells, as you can see here, but they were formed from anew, as Aristotle showed in the example of the chicken development. And I want that you see what the first scientists saw when they were asking this question. These are sperms, and I was wondering, do you see tiny humans inside of the sperm or no? And more than asking for a yes or not, I think most of you said like there is not enough resolution. And this was one problem that they had, because here you can say that there is a human inside, or you can say that no. But maybe the best answer is like, until we don't have a better resolution, we cannot say anything. So I will show you what happened when they start developing better microscopes and what they start observing. Now, as I know that some of you don't study biology, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background. The sperm cells are gametes, and they are producing the testicular organs of humans as well as animals. And although in the beginning we didn't have a lot of resolution, now we have a much better resolution. This is a picture of a fancy microscope that show you in more detail how the sperm look like. Here, for example, we have been able to identify different sections, so now we know in detail what is in the tail, what you have in the middle piece, and what there is in the head. So for example, here in the middle piece, we know that there is a lot of mitochondria, as here you need to move the tail to displace. So, and this is very important for the sperm cells. So you have a mitochondria that is the powerhouse of the cell, so it produces a lot of energy that allows it to move very fast. And this is not going to be in the test. I just want to show you that we know we have made a huge improvement in understanding the gametes, and definitely here there is no humans. Yeah, here you are not going to find a baby, but we didn't know that. We were looking with this resolution. So although these ideas right now sounds crazy, at that time they were actually very valid. A little bit more of background in case that you want to study biology. There is two types of cells, somatic cells and gametes, and these could be in the test, so make sure to study it. The somatic cells are the body cells. So for example, the ones from the skin, for the liver, for the eyeballs. So all the cells, you know that they have, for example, in humans, they will have here 46 chromosomes, while the gametes, on the other hand, are the sex cells, the egg and the sperm, and this is the DNA information that it will be transferred to your kids. And as you have two, the male, the female, and the male, they're going to fuse to form a zygote that it will form the embryo. So this one will have only half of the information. So in this case, they will have 23 chromosomes, so 23 here, 23 here, and when they fuse, they will form 46. So this is important. Remember to study what are the difference between somatic cells and gametes. Now, to understand this debate between preformism and epigenesis, I want that you watch the following video that describes in a lot of detail the development of these two fields.
So in terms of the history of the field, I thought I'd start out with an idea that today seems really, really strange, but it's one that was actually fairly popular during the 16 and 1700s. And this idea was the concept of the homunculus. So this term homunculus refers to a belief that was shared by a number of early developmental biologists who thought that the reproductive cells, and I should add here, there was some debate about whether this was true for the sperm or the egg, but the general idea was that the reproductive cells contain miniature adult individuals. So if we were talking about human reproduction, for example, the notion for at least some biologists at the time was literally that there were miniature humans present within the sperm or the egg. And these were thought to have all the same body parts, same anatomical features and everything that you'd find in fully grown humans, just much, much smaller. So according to this idea, development is really simply a matter of growth of this pre-existing individual that's already present within the reproductive cells. Now, there were a variety of different terms that biologists used to refer to these hypothetical individuals, and one of these was homunculus, which is actually Latin for little man. And this is a famous picture showing what one of these miniature humans was imagined to have looked like. This was drawn by an early Dutch microscopist who was one of the first to observe sperm cells under the microscope. And it shows what he imagined to be present within the head of the sperm. Now, this was from the late 1600s, and at the time, light microscopes didn't really offer a high enough resolution that he would have been able to see something like that, even had it been there. So it's just a depiction of what he imagined to be present. But I do think it's a really nice illustration of the thinking amongst a number of biologists at the time about how development might work. Now, of course, we know today that from a scientific standpoint, this was not a particularly good idea, to say the least. But I think it definitely gets points for creativity, and it's just a really fascinating chapter in the history of the field. So I thought it would be a fun way to start this lecture. One of the cool things about teaching online is that you can do things that you wouldn't normally do in a typical classroom type setting. Like, for example, changing your shirt right in the middle of a lecture. And I really couldn't resist doing that here because I've got the world's perfect t-shirt for talking about the homunculus. So I'm from the state of New Hampshire, and we have a great microbrewery here called Smarty Nose Brewing Company. And interestingly enough, one of the beers they make is called Homunculus. So this is the shirt they have to go with the beer. And I love the clever slogan on the front. As you can imagine, it's a hoppy beer. And then the back's got this really great picture of a bunch of sperm swimming toward an egg. And if you take a closer look here, the egg is actually the bottom of a beer bottle, and then all the sperm swimming toward it have little homunculi in them, which are actually the faces of the brewers and other staff members. So anyway, I thought it was a great shirt, and I figured I'd never have a more appropriate occasion than this to show it off. Okay, there's another term I'd like to introduce here before moving on, and that is Preformationism, which is essentially just the belief in a homunculus or something analogous to it. And just to reiterate, the key idea with this concept is that the adult individual is assumed to be preformed or already present within either the sperm or the egg prior to fertilization. So according to this line of thinking, development is really simply a matter of growth of this pre-existing individual. Now, there were probably a couple of different reasons why this was a popular idea during much of the 16 and 1700s. For starters, if you're trying to understand how organisms develop, it's a lot easier to think about growth of a preformed organism than it is to try and come up with an explanation for how a complete new individual is going to arise de novo or form anew with each passing generation. So maybe your task as a scientist is a little bit easier if you're just trying to think about how a preformed individual would grow. Additionally, Preformationism fit pretty nicely with some creationist ideas about the origins of human life. And there were some people who took the homunculus concept to the extreme and postulated that because it was thought to be an adult organism, that the homunculus would contain its own set of reproductive cells, which would have homunculi within them. And then those homunculi would have still another generation of reproductive cells and homunculi, and so on and so on. So this is kind of analogous to the traditional Russian stacking doll, where you have one that fits inside of another, and then another smaller doll that fits inside of that, et cetera, et cetera. So with this kind of model, a divine creator is assumed to have created all the humans that are ever going to be present on Earth in the form of something like a family of human stacking dolls made up of multiple generations of homunculi. There were certainly biologists at the time who raised objections to those types of models. For example, if you're going to accept that type of model, then by extension, you're going to be forced to accept one of two alternatives, neither of which seems to make a whole lot of sense. Either you'd have to assume that there's going to be a finite and ultimately very limited number of total human generations that will ever occur, or you would have to somehow account for the fact that at some point there's going to have to be a homunculus that would be presumably smaller than the smallest unit of matter in order to fit into the homunculus from the previous generation. So neither of those scenarios seems particularly logical, and for those types of reasons, even at the time when preformationism and these types of creationist ideas were proposed, there were certainly biologists who raised objections and favored alternative models. Now, the other idea that had been proposed to explain how development works is referred to as epigenesis. And this theory states that individuals arise and acquire their ultimate form through a series of progressive changes. Interestingly, this theory of epigenesis actually predates preformationism by a couple thousand years. This goes all the way back to the time of Aristotle. And you may recall that Aristotle was a famous Greek philosopher who studied all sorts of different fields, including developmental biology. He was actually one of the earliest developmental biologists, at least in recorded history. And Aristotle spent some time observing developing chicken embryos. He would crack open fertilized eggs at different stages and observe the developing embryos. And based on those observations, he formulated a number of different ideas about how development occurs, including proposing this theory of epigenesis. So of course we know today that Aristotle was absolutely right about this, and you probably take the theory of epigenesis for granted. But I think it's important to remember that Aristotle really had no knowledge of cells. He didn't really understand anything about fertilization or how that works. So given his lack of knowledge about how development begins, I think it was actually pretty impressive that he had the insight to realize this is in fact how development occurs. Anyway, fast forward a couple thousand years and you have the preformationists, at least temporarily, taking us a pretty big step backward. But ultimately, the scientists who favored the theory of epigenesis prevailed in the debate over epigenesis versus preformationism. And that was primarily for two key reasons, both of which had to do with the development of better light microscopes. So first of all, scientists were continuing to observe tissues from a variety of different species under the microscope, and they recognized that all living organisms are composed of cells. So that's a key part of the cell theory, right? That cells are the fundamental unit of life. Additionally, developmental biologists are looking at sperm and looking at eggs under the microscope, and they recognize that those are both individual cells. They're very specialized cells, but individual cells nonetheless. And so taken together, these two observations are very problematic for the preformationists, because the homunculus should be composed of cells, but that would in turn mean that either the sperm or the egg should contain many smaller cells. And of course, that's not what was observed. So basically, there's a growing disconnect here between some of the predictions of preformationism and what scientists are actually observing. And together with some other experimental results that I'll tell you about in future lectures, this eventually leads to widespread acceptance of epigenesis and rejection of preformationism. And this was a really important point in the history of the field, because as we head into the 1800s, that really changes the way that biologists approach the problem of development. So at this point, you can start looking at it as follows. Development begins with the fusion of two individual cells, an egg and a sperm, that are going to come together at fertilization, and then that will lead to a whole series of progressive changes that we can collectively refer to as epigenesis, and that will culminate in the formation of a new individual. So let's say we're talking about human development here. I'm a really lousy artist, but if you give me a second, I'll try and diagram a newborn human here. Okay, like I said, I'm a pretty lousy artist, so that's supposed to be a newborn infant and not some kind of weird-looking space alien or something. But anyway, you get the point, right? In the 1800s, developmental biologists are starting to think about the problem of development in terms of what are the various processes that underlie epigenesis. In other words, what are the series of events that are going to underlie this really incredible transformation?